Ambassador Marcus Chen adjusted his formal diplomatic uniform one last time as he stood before the massive crystalline doors of the Zephyrian throne room. The doors themselves were carved from a single piece of translucent blue stone that seemed to pulse with inner light. Strange symbols floated across its surface like living tattoos, and Marcus could feel a slight vibration through the soles of his boots, as ancient mechanisms prepared to grant him entry to one of the most powerful courts in the galaxy. This was humanity's first official diplomatic mission to the Zephyrian Empire, and the weight of representing his entire species pressed down on Marcus's shoulders like a heavy cloak. Behind him stood Dr. Sarah Martinez, the mission's xenobiologist, and Captain James Rodriguez, their military attaché. All three humans had spent months preparing for this moment, studying every available piece of information about Zephyrian culture, politics, and social customs. The Zephyrians were an ancient insectoid race that had controlled this sector of space for over 3,000 years. They were tall, elegant beings with chitinous exoskeletons that gleamed like polished metal, compound eyes that could see across multiple light spectrums, and delicate antennae that constantly moved to sample the air around them. Their society was built on rigid hierarchy and the concept of absolute strength, where weakness was not just discouraged but actively eliminated. As the massive doors began to swing open with a sound like distant thunder, Marcus felt his heart rate increase. The throne room beyond was vast enough to hold a small city, with soaring crystal pillars that stretched up into shadows far overhead. The walls were covered in intricate carvings that told the story of Zephyrian conquest across the stars, and floating platforms of various sizes drifted slowly through the air, each one carrying important nobles and courtiers who watched the human delegation with barely concealed disdain. Queen Vexithari sat upon a throne that seemed to be grown rather than built, its organic curves rising from the floor like a massive flower made of the same blue crystal as the doors. She was enormous even by Zephyrian standards, nearly 9 feet tall with forearms that ended in delicate but deadly-looking claws. Her exoskeleton was a deep emerald green shot through with veins of gold, and her compound eyes reflected the light in thousands of tiny rainbows as she watched the humans approach. The court was filled with hundreds of Zephyrian nobles, warriors, and advisors. They lined the walls and filled the floating platforms, their bodies creating a symphony of soft clicking sounds as their chitinous plates shifted against each other. Marcus had read that these sounds were actually a form of communication, expressing everything from mild disapproval to open hostility, and right now the symphony seemed decidedly unwelcoming. Marcus led his small delegation down the long approach to the throne, their footsteps echoing in the vast space. The protocol demanded that they stop exactly 20 paces from the base of the throne and wait to be acknowledged. As they walked, Marcus could feel hundreds of alien eyes tracking their movement, and he heard the subtle changes in the clicking sounds that suggested the court was discussing the humans in their sonic language. They reached the proper distance and stopped. Marcus clasped his hands behind his back and waited, as protocol demanded. Beside him, Dr. Martinez held the ceremonial gift they had brought, a holographic display showing the diversity of Earth's ecosystems, while Captain Rodriguez maintained the military bearing that would hopefully demonstrate human strength without appearing threatening. Queen Vexithari studied them for several long minutes without speaking. Her head tilted slightly as her antennae tasted the air around the humans, and Marcus wondered what chemical information she was gathering about their emotional state. Finally, she spoke, her voice a melodious blend of harmonic tones that the universal translator rendered into heavily accented English. "So these are the mammals who dared to petition for recognition from the Zephyrian Empire," she said. And the court's clicking sounds increased in what Marcus interpreted as amusement. "You are smaller than our reports suggested, and you lack the natural weapons that mark a true warrior species. Tell us, Ambassador Marcus Chen of Earth, what possible value could your kind offer to an empire that has conquered the stars?" Marcus had rehearsed his response countless times, but standing here in this magnificent and intimidating throne room, facing a being who could probably tear him apart with her bare claws, the words felt fragile and inadequate. Still, he drew upon his diplomatic training and spoke clearly and confidently. "Your Majesty, humanity offers the Zephyrian Empire something that cannot be taken by conquest, or built through technology. We offer partnership based on mutual respect, shared knowledge, and the kind of cooperation that makes both species stronger than they could ever be alone. We have learned much in our short time among the stars, and we believe that diversity of thought and approach leads to solutions that no single species could achieve. The Queen's antennae twitched, and several nobles on the floating platforms made sounds that the translator interpreted as scoffs of derision. One particularly large warrior, whose exoskeleton was scarred from many battles, stepped forward from his platform. "Your Majesty," the warrior said, "these creatures speak of cooperation, but they have no understanding of strength. They are soft, weak beings who hide behind metal shells instead of growing proper armor. They reproduce like parasites and consume resources without contributing anything of value. Perhaps we should demonstrate what true strength looks like." The warrior's challenge sent a ripple of excitement through the court, and Marcus felt the tension in the room increase dramatically. This was not going according to the carefully planned script that the diplomatic corps had prepared. Dr. Martinez shifted nervously beside him, and he could sense Captain Rodriguez calculating distances and escape routes, even though they all knew that fighting their way out of this situation was impossible. Before the situation could escalate further, something unexpected happened that changed everything. A small figure darted out from behind one of the crystal pillars near the throne, moving with the quick, panicked movements of a frightened child. The figure was clearly young, perhaps half the size of the adult Zephyrians, with a more delicate exoskeleton that had not yet developed the metallic hardness of maturity. The young Zephyrian was being chased by another warrior, this one wearing the ornate armor that marked him as a member of one of the rival noble houses. The warrior was shouting something in the clicking language that made several courtiers recoil in shock, and as he reached for the small figure with claws extended, the young Zephyrian let out a sound of pure terror. In that moment of panic, the child did something that no one in the throne room could have predicted. Instead of running to the Queen or seeking shelter among the other nobles, the small Zephyrian ran straight toward the human delegation and threw himself behind Marcus, pressing against the ambassador's legs and wrapping small arms around his waist. The entire throne room fell into absolute silence. The clicking sounds stopped as if someone had thrown a switch, and even the subtle hum of the floating platforms seemed to fade away. Marcus looked down at the trembling child clinging to him and felt every eye in the room focused on this unprecedented moment. The young Zephyrian was clearly terrified, his whole body shaking as he pressed himself against Marcus for protection. The child's compound eyes were wide with fear, and Marcus could see small scratches and bruises on his delicate exoskeleton that suggested this was not the first time he had been chased or hurt. Queen Vexithari rose from her throne, her forearms spreading wide in a gesture that radiated pure fury. Her voice, when she spoke, was like the sound of grinding metal, and every word dripped with barely controlled rage. "Kithara," she commanded, "return to your place immediately. You shame yourself and your bloodline by seeking protection from these inferior mammals." But the child, whose name was apparently Kithara, only clung tighter to Marcus, his small claws gripping the fabric of the human's uniform. Marcus found himself in an impossible position, holding a trembling alien child while surrounded by hundreds of potentially hostile beings who clearly viewed his very presence as an insult to their natural order. Marcus felt the small alien child trembling against his legs and made a decision that would change everything. Instead of pushing Kithara away or trying to return him to the Queen, Marcus placed his hands gently on the child's shoulders in a protective gesture. The movement was instinctive, the same way any human adult might comfort a frightened child. But in the Zephyrian throne room, it was like throwing a bomb into a powder keg. The Queen's fury was visible in every line of her massive body. Her compound eyes blazed with reflected light from the crystal walls, and her forearms moved in sharp, aggressive gestures that made several lesser nobles step back in fear. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who had ruled an empire for centuries and was not accustomed to being defied. "Human," she said, and the word sounded like a curse in her melodious voice. "You will release my offspring immediately and step away. Your ignorance of our customs might have been forgiven, but your continued interference in royal family matters is an act of war." Marcus looked up at the towering Queen, his hands still resting protectively on Kithara's shoulders. He could feel the child's rapid breathing and the way the small body pressed closer to him whenever the Queen's voice rose. Something was very wrong here, and every human instinct Marcus possessed was telling him that this child needed protection more than humanity needed this diplomatic alliance. "Your Majesty," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the impossible situation he found himself in. "Among my people, protecting the young is the most sacred duty we have. It comes before politics, before alliances, before everything else. This child came to me seeking safety, and I cannot in good conscience force him back to whatever he is running from." The throne room erupted in chaos. Nobles on the floating platforms began clicking rapidly in their sonic language, creating a cacophony of outraged sounds that made Marcus's ears ring. Several warriors stepped forward with their hands on their weapons, while others seemed to be arguing among themselves about what this unprecedented situation meant for the Empire's reputation. Dr. Martinez moved closer to Marcus, her scientific training warring with her diplomatic responsibilities. She had studied Zephyrian culture extensively and knew that what Marcus was doing could be interpreted as an act of aggression, but she also saw what Marcus was seeing. The child was covered in small bruises and scratches that were barely visible against his natural coloring, and his behavior showed all the signs of trauma that she recognized from her work with injured animals. Captain Rodriguez positioned himself to protect the small group's flanks, his military instincts taking over even though he knew they were impossibly outnumbered. His hand moved instinctively toward his sidearm before he caught himself and forced his arms to remain at his sides. Starting a firefight in the Queen's throne room would accomplish nothing except getting them all killed. The scarred warrior who had challenged humanity's strength earlier stepped forward again, his massive form casting a shadow over the human delegation. His voice was filled with contempt as he addressed the court rather than speaking directly to Marcus. "You see," he declared, "these mammals have no understanding of proper behavior. They contaminate our young with their weakness and then dare to lecture us about their primitive customs. Perhaps it is time to show them what strength truly means." But as the warrior spoke, something else began to happen in the throne room. Other young Zephyrians, who had been hiding in alcoves and behind pillars throughout the vast space, began to emerge cautiously. They did not approach Marcus directly, but they moved into positions where they could watch what was happening, and Marcus noticed that several of them showed the same signs of injury and fear that Kithara displayed. Queen Vexithari noticed the movement as well, and her rage seemed to shift into something more complex and dangerous. She had ruled the Empire for over 2 centuries, and her authority had never been questioned so directly. More importantly, the presence of other damaged royal children suggested problems in her court that she had preferred to keep hidden. "Guards," she commanded, and a dozen armored Zephyrian soldiers moved into position around the human delegation. "Take the child by force if necessary. These mammals will learn that our customs are not subject to their approval." Marcus felt Kithara's grip tighten on his uniform, and the child's terrified whimper was audible even over the chaos in the throne room. The sound triggered something primal in Marcus's protective instincts, and he found himself speaking before his diplomatic training could stop him. "No," he said firmly, his voice carrying clearly across the vast space. "I won't let you hurt him." The simple declaration sent shockwaves through the assembled court. A mammal, a creature they considered barely evolved beyond primitive animal status, was directly refusing a command from their queen. It was unprecedented, unthinkable, and absolutely terrifying in its implications. Dr. Martinez stepped closer to Marcus and spoke quietly, hoping her words would not carry to the listening nobles. "Marcus, we need to think about this carefully. If we start an international incident over this child, it could mean war between our species. Thousands of humans could die because of what we do here today." Marcus heard her words and understood the logic behind them, but when he looked down at Kithara's terrified face, he knew he could not abandon the child. There were some things more important than politics, and protecting an innocent life was one of them. "Sarah," he replied softly, "look at him. Really look. Those aren't accidental injuries. Someone has been deliberately hurting this child, and probably others like him. How can we call ourselves civilized if we walk away from that? Captain Rodriguez had also noticed the signs of abuse, and his jaw tightened as he came to the same conclusion Marcus had reached. "Sir," he said quietly, "if we're going to take a stand on this, we need to be smart about it. That warrior who's been making threats looks like he's about to try something, and there are at least 50 armed guards in this room." As if summoned by the captain's words, the scarred warrior took another step forward, his claws extending in a clear threat display. But before he could speak or act, something unexpected happened that changed the entire dynamic of the confrontation. One of the other young Zephyrians who had emerged from hiding, a female slightly older than Kithara, stepped forward and spoke, in a clear, carrying voice. "The human speaks truth," she said, her words causing absolute silence to fall over the throne room. "The trials hurt us. They have always hurt us. But we were taught that speaking of it would bring shame to the royal house." Queen Vexithari turned toward the young female with an expression that mixed shock, fury, and something that might have been fear. "Zixandra," she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, "return to your chambers immediately. You do not know what you are saying." But other young voices began to join Zixandra's, creating a chorus of testimony that made the adult nobles shift uncomfortably. They spoke of training sessions that left them injured and terrorized, of being told that weakness must be burned out of them through pain, of watching siblings disappear when they could not meet the impossible standards set for royal children. Marcus felt his heart breaking as he listened to their stories, but he also felt a growing anger at the system that had created such suffering. When the young voices finally fell silent, he looked up at Queen Vexithari with new understanding and new determination. "Your Majesty," he said, "among humans, we have a saying that the measure of a civilization is how it treats its most vulnerable members. These children are not weak because they feel pain or fear. They are strong because they survived something that should never have happened to them in the first place." The Queen's response would determine whether this confrontation ended in bloodshed or became the beginning of something that could change both their species forever. Queen Vexithari stood motionless for several heartbeats, her compound eyes reflecting the crystal light as she processed what had just happened. The testimony of the royal children hung in the air like a poison cloud, and Marcus could see the political calculations running behind her alien features. This was no longer just about a diplomatic incident or even about protecting Kithara. The foundation of Zephyrian royal tradition had been publicly questioned, and the Queen's response would determine the future of her empire. The scarred warrior, whose name Marcus had learned was General Thokran, stepped into the silence with the confidence of someone who had spent his life solving problems with violence. His massive form cast shadows across the crystal floor as he addressed the Queen directly, ignoring the humans entirely. "Your Majesty," General Thokran said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who commanded armies, "these mammals have poisoned the minds of our young with their weak philosophies. The children speak nonsense because they have been contaminated by alien ideas. The solution is simple. We remove the source of contamination and remind the royal offspring of their proper place in our society." Several nobles on the floating platforms clicked their agreement, and Marcus felt the political tide turning against them. He could see that many of the court members viewed this situation as an opportunity to demonstrate Zephyrian superiority over the upstart human species. The children who had spoken out looked terrified again, realizing that their moment of courage might have made things worse rather than better. But Queen Vexithari surprised everyone with her response. Instead of immediately ordering the humans arrested or executed, she gestured for absolute silence and then spoke in a voice that carried centuries of accumulated wisdom and pain. "General Thokran," she said, "you speak of tradition and strength as if they were the same thing. But I have ruled this empire for 200 years, and I have seen the results of our methods. Each generation of royal children is smaller than the last. Each year we lose more of our young to the trials than graduate to adulthood. Perhaps it is time to question whether our traditions are making us stronger or slowly destroying us." The admission sent shockwaves through the throne room. Several nobles began clicking frantically in their sonic language, and Marcus could see alliances forming and dissolving in real time as the political implications of the Queen's words became clear. This was not just about human interference anymore. This was about the future direction of the entire Zephyrian Empire. Dr. Martinez, who had been quietly observing the biological and behavioral patterns of the Zephyrians throughout the confrontation, stepped forward carefully. Her scientific training had taught her to recognize patterns that others might miss, and what she had observed was deeply troubling. "Your Majesty," Dr. Martinez said, "if I may be permitted to speak, I believe there may be scientific evidence to support your concerns about the current system." Queen Vexithari's antennae twitched with interest, and she gestured for the human scientist to continue. General Thokran made a sound of disgust, but the Queen's authority was absolute when she chose to exercise it. "During our preparation for this diplomatic mission," Dr. Martinez continued, "we studied the genetic and biological data that your empire shared with us as part of the cultural exchange protocols. The patterns we observed suggest that the psychological trauma inflicted during the traditional trials may be causing genetic damage that accumulates over generations." The throne room fell silent again, but this time it was the silence of attention rather than shock. Dr. Martinez had touched on something that many of the nobles had noticed but been afraid to discuss openly: the declining birth rates, the increasing difficulty of successful reproduction, the growing aggression that seemed to solve fewer problems each year. "Explain," Queen Vexithari commanded. Dr. Martinez took a deep breath, knowing that her next words could either save the situation or get them all killed. "Your Majesty, trauma affects not just the mind, but the body as well. When young organisms are subjected to severe stress during their developmental phases, it can cause changes in their genetic expression that get passed on to their offspring. The fear and pain that the children experience during the trials may be literally rewriting their DNA in ways that make each successive generation less capable of thriving." General Thokran stepped forward aggressively, his claws extended in a clear threat. "You dare suggest that our sacred traditions are harming us? This is exactly the kind of poisonous thinking that weak species use to justify their failures. Strength comes from overcoming adversity, not from hiding from it." But before the confrontation could escalate further, Kithara did something that surprised everyone in the throne room. The young Zephyrian, who had been clinging silently to Marcus throughout the entire exchange, looked up at his mother and spoke in a clear, steady voice. "Mother," he said, "the human did not teach me to be weak. He taught me that I do not have to be afraid all the time. When the trials began, I thought fear was the only thing that kept me alive. But when I hid behind him, I felt safe for the first time in my memory." Is feeling safe really a sign of weakness? The question hung in the air like a physical presence, and Marcus could see that it had struck deep into Queen Vexithari's consciousness. For a moment, the massive alien queen looked less like an imperial ruler and more like a mother who was beginning to question choices she had never thought to examine. The other young Zephyrians who had emerged from hiding began to move closer, encouraged by Kithara's courage. They formed a loose circle around the human delegation, not quite touching but clearly seeking the same sense of safety that Kithara had found. Their presence created a visual representation of the choice facing the Empire: continue the old ways or find a new path forward. Captain Rodriguez, who had been maintaining his military bearing throughout the crisis, stepped forward and addressed the Queen with the respect due to a fellow leader who faced impossible decisions. "Your Majesty," he said, "in human military tradition, we have learned that the strongest soldiers are not those who feel no fear, but those who feel fear and continue to act with honor despite it. True strength comes not from eliminating weakness, but from overcoming it while maintaining compassion for others who struggle with the same challenges." Queen Vexithari looked around her throne room, taking in the sight of her traumatized children seeking comfort from aliens, her nobles divided between tradition and change, and her most trusted general arguing for solutions that increasingly looked like the same problems that had brought them to this point. The weight of imperial responsibility pressed down on her like a physical force. "General Thokran," she said finally, "you speak of strength and tradition, but look around this room. Look at our children. If our methods are so superior, why do they run to strangers for the safety they cannot find among their own people? The general's response was immediate and harsh. Because they have been contaminated by alien weakness. The solution is not to abandon our ways, but to purify them of outside influence. Give me permission to deal with these mammals as they deserve, and I will restore proper order to this court. The threat was unmistakable, and Marcus felt the protective circle of young Zephyrians press closer to the humans. He realized that this confrontation was no longer just about diplomatic relations between species. It had become a fundamental conflict about the nature of civilization itself, and the children they were trying to protect had become symbols of everything at stake. Queen Vexithari rose from her throne, her full height making her an imposing figure, even in the vast crystal chamber. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of absolute power and the weight of a decision that would reshape her empire. "General Thokran," she said, "I am placing the humans under palace protection while I consider this matter. Any attempt to harm them or the children will be considered an act of treason against the crown." The palace protection that Queen Vexithari had granted was both a blessing and a trap. Marcus and his team were given luxurious quarters in the royal wing, but they were also under constant guard by soldiers whose loyalty was divided between their queen and the traditional ways that General Thokran represented. The crystal walls that surrounded them were beautiful, but they were still walls, and everyone knew that the queen's protection was only as strong as her political position. For 3 days. The palace buzzed with tension as nobles held secret meetings and warriors chose sides in what was becoming a civil war of ideas. The traditional faction, led by General Thokran, argued that the empire's strength came from eliminating weakness through harsh trials. The reform faction, growing around the queen's new doubts, began to question whether their ancient methods were actually destroying them from within. Marcus spent those 3 days doing something that no human had ever done before. He became a teacher to alien royalty, not through force or formal authority, but simply by showing Kithura and the other young Zephyrians that there were different ways to face the world. The royal children, initially terrified and suspicious, gradually began to trust him as they realized that his gentle approach did not hide weakness, but revealed a different kind of strength. Kithara was the first to truly embrace the human way of learning. Instead of being forced to overcome obstacles through pain and fear, Marcus showed him how to approach challenges with curiosity and patience. When the young Zephyrian struggled with a complex puzzle that was part of his traditional education, Marcus did not punish failure or demand immediate success. Instead, he sat beside Kithara and worked through the problem step by step, celebrating small victories and treating mistakes as opportunities to learn rather than signs of weakness. The change in Kithara was remarkable and terrifying to the watching court. Within days, the small Zephyrian was solving problems that had previously been impossible for him, not because he had become physically stronger, but because he was no longer paralyzed by the fear of making mistakes. His natural intelligence, freed from the constant terror of punishment, began to flourish in ways that amazed even Dr. Martinez. Dr. Martinez used her time in protective custody to conduct careful observations of the royal children and document the psychological and physical effects of the traditional trial system. What she discovered was even worse than she had initially suspected. The trauma was not just affecting individual children, but was creating genetic changes that were passed down through generations, making each successive generation of Zephyrians less capable of the very strength their culture claimed to value. The other royal children watched Kithara's transformation with a mixture of hope and disbelief. Zixandra, the young female who had first spoken out in the throne room, began to approach Marcus with careful questions about human methods of education and development. She was older than Kithara and had endured more of the traditional trials, making her recovery slower and more difficult, but even she began to show signs of the confidence that came from feeling safe. Captain Rodriguez used his military experience to observe the palace guard and assess the growing political tension. He could see that General Thokran was building support among the warrior class, using the human presence as proof that the empire was becoming weak and needed strong leadership to restore proper order. The captain also noticed that several of The younger guards were beginning to question their loyalty as they watched the positive changes in the royal children. On the evening of the third day, Queen Vexithari made an announcement that sent shockwaves through the entire palace. She declared that there would be a formal trial to determine the future of royal education in the Zephyrian Empire. The trial would pit the traditional methods against the human approach, with Kithara as the test subject. If the human methods could produce a stronger, more capable royal heir than the traditional trials, then the empire would consider fundamental changes to their ancient ways. General Thakran accepted the challenge eagerly, seeing it as an opportunity to prove once and for all that human weakness had no place in Zephyrian society. He proposed that the trial should be a test of survival skills, combat ability, and leadership potential, conducted in the ancient arena beneath the palace where generations of royal children had either proven their worth or died in the attempt. Marcus felt his blood run cold when he learned the details of the proposed trial. The arena was a death trap, designed to eliminate weakness through the most brutal methods imaginable. Participants faced not only physical obstacles, but also predatory creatures bred specifically to test the survival instincts of young Zephyrians. The mortality rate was over 30%, and those who survived were often left with physical and psychological scars that lasted for life. "Your Majesty," Marcus said when he was brought before the Queen to discuss the trial, "what you are proposing is not a test of strength. It is a gamble with a child's life. If something happens to Kithara in that arena, no amount of political change will bring him back." Queen Vexithari looked older than she had just days before, the weight of her decision etched into every line of her magnificent form. "Ambassador Chen," she replied, "I understand your concerns, but the trial is the only way to settle this matter. Definitively, the traditional faction will never accept change unless it is proven in the arena, and if I refuse the challenge, General Thakran will have the justification he needs to claim that I am unfit to rule." Kithara, who had been listening to the conversation with the alert intelligence that Marcus had helped nurture, stepped forward and spoke with a maturity that surprised everyone present. "Mother," he said, "I am not afraid of the trial anymore. Not because I do not understand the danger, but because I finally understand what real strength means. The human taught me that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to do what is right despite being afraid. I want to face this trial, not to prove that I am strong enough to survive pain, but to show everyone that there is a better way to be strong." Dr. Martinez had been working frantically to find alternatives to the deadly trial, and she stepped forward with a proposal that might save Kithara's life while still satisfying the political requirements of the situation. "Your Majesty," she said, "what if we modified the trial to test real-world leadership and problem-solving skills rather than simply survival? Instead of sending Kithara into the arena alone to face predators and death traps, we could create scenarios that test his ability to think, to lead, to solve complex problems under pressure, and to work with others to achieve common goals." General Thakran immediately objected to any modification of the traditional trial, arguing that changing the format would invalidate the results. But Queen Vexithari found herself intrigued by the possibility of a test that measured actual leadership ability, rather than simply the capacity to endure punishment. The debate that followed was intense and sometimes heated, with nobles arguing passionately for both sides. In the end, it was Kithara himself who provided the solution that satisfied both factions. "Why not have both?" he asked with the simple logic that children sometimes bring to complex problems. "Let me face the traditional trial, but let me face it the human way. Instead of trying to survive through fear and violence, let me show that intelligence, compassion, and cooperation can be just as effective as claws and aggression." The proposal was so unexpected that it left both sides temporarily speechless. The idea of facing the deadly arena trial using human methods seemed impossible, but it would definitively prove which approach was superior. If Kithara succeeded, it would revolutionize Zephyrian society. If he failed, the human influence would be discredited forever. Queen Vexithari looked at her young son with a mixture of pride and terror, knowing that she was about to gamble everything on a child's courage and a human's revolutionary ideas about strength. The ancient arena beneath the palace was a terrifying monument to generations of Zephyrian tradition, carved from black stone and lit by floating crystals that cast eerie shadows across the walls. It had witnessed the triumph and death of countless royal children over the centuries. The arena floor was covered with obstacles, trapdoors, and hunting grounds for the predatory creatures that were released during the trials. Bloodstains that had resisted all attempts at cleaning marked the spots where young Zephyrians had fallen in pursuit of strength through suffering. Marcus stood in the observation gallery alongside Queen Vexithari and the assembled court, watching, as Kithara was led into the arena by silent guards. The small Zephyrian looked impossibly fragile in the vast space, but Marcus could see the steady way he held himself and the alert intelligence in his compound eyes. 3 days of human-style teaching had not made Kithara physically larger or stronger, but it had given him something far more valuable: the confidence to think his way through problems instead of simply enduring them. General Thokran stood at the Queen's other side, his scarred form radiating satisfaction as he watched the proceedings. He had designed this trial personally, incorporating every traditional element that had tested royal children for generations. The arena contained 3 separate challenges that would test survival skills, combat ability, and leadership judgment. Most importantly, he had ensured that the final challenge would require Kithara to face a juvenile shadow hunter, one of the most dangerous predators in Zephyrian space. "Your Majesty," General Thokran said with barely concealed triumph, "observe how your son approaches the first obstacle. Already we can see the weakness that human influence has bred into him. A properly trained royal child would charge forward aggressively, using speed and violence to overcome the challenge. Instead, he hesitates and thinks, wasting precious time that could cost him his life." But Marcus saw something different in Kithara's careful approach to the first obstacle: a maze of spinning blades and pressure plates that had maimed dozens of royal children over the years. Instead of rushing forward blindly, Kithara was studying the pattern of the blades, observing how the pressure plates triggered different responses, and calculating the safest path through the deadly machinery. When Kithara finally moved, it was with purpose and precision rather than desperate speed. He ducked under spinning blades at exactly the right moment, stepped on pressure plates in a sequence that deactivated the most dangerous traps, and emerged from the maze without a single injury. The watching nobles clicked in surprise, having expected to see blood and terror rather than careful problem-solving. Dr. Martinez leaned forward in her seat, making careful observations of Kithara's vital signs through the bioscanners that monitored all trial participants. His heart rate was elevated but steady, showing stress without panic. His breathing was controlled and rhythmic. Most importantly, his brain activity showed the complex patterns associated with active learning and adaptation, rather than the simple survival responses that characterized most trial participants. The second challenge required Kithara to navigate a series of physical obstacles while being hunted by mechanical pursuit drones that had been programmed to test combat reflexes. Traditional royal children were expected to destroy the drones through direct confrontation, using their natural weapons and aggressive instincts to prove their warrior capabilities. Kithara took a completely different approach. Instead of fighting the drones, he studied their movement patterns and began to understand their programming. When the first drone attacked, Kithara did not meet it with claws and fury as expected. Instead, he led it into a collision with one of the arena's structural supports, using the environment itself as a weapon. When more drones joined the hunt, he turned them against each other, creating a cascade of mechanical failures that eliminated the threat without requiring him to engage in direct combat. General Thokran's satisfaction began to turn into concern as he watched Kithara succeed through methods that violated every tradition of royal testing. "This is not strength," he declared to the assembled court. "This is cowardice disguised as cleverness. True warriors face their enemies directly, not through tricks and deception." But Queen Vexithari found herself fascinated by her son's performance. She had faced the same trials centuries ago and still bore scars from the injuries she had sustained while proving her worthiness to rule. Watching Kithara solve problems without accumulating damage or trauma was revolutionary in ways that challenged everything she thought she knew about strength and leadership. Captain Rodriguez observed the trial through the lens of his military experience and recognized something that the Zephyrian nobles were missing. Kithara was not avoiding combat out of fear or weakness. He was demonstrating the kind of tactical thinking that made the difference between good soldiers and great commanders. The ability to achieve objectives while minimizing casualties was one of the most valued skills in human military doctrine. The final challenge was designed to be decisive. A juvenile shadow hunter was released into the arena, its sleek black form moving with deadly grace as it sought its prey. Shadow hunters were apex predators that had evolved specifically to hunt Zephyrians, using stealth, speed, and paralyzing venom to bring down creatures much larger than themselves. Even experienced warriors treated them with extreme caution, and expecting a child to face one was considered the ultimate test of royal worthiness. The shadow hunter located Kithara quickly and began its stalking approach, moving through the arena's shadows with fluid menace. The watching court fell silent, knowing that this moment would determine not just Kithara's fate, but the future direction of their entire civilization. Marcus felt his hands clench into fists as he watched the predator circle closer to Kithara, but he forced himself to remain silent. This was the test that Kithara had chosen to face, and interfering now would invalidate everything they had worked toward. He could only watch and hope that the lessons he had taught would be enough to save the child he had come to care about. Kithara stood perfectly still as the shadow hunter approached, but Marcus could see that he was not frozen with fear as many expected. Instead, the young Zephyrian was observing the predator with the same careful attention he had given to the mechanical obstacles. When the shadow hunter finally struck, launching itself through the air with claws extended and venom sacs ready to discharge, Kithara did something that no one in the arena had ever seen before. He spoke to it, using a combination of chemical signals, body language, and sonic frequencies that Dr. Martinez had taught him about during their discussions of interspecies communication. Kithara addressed the shadow hunter not as prey addressing a predator, but as one intelligent being attempting to communicate with another. The shadow hunter landed just short of Kithara and paused, its head tilted in confusion as it processed the unexpected signals. The predator had been trained to hunt Zephyrians who responded with fear, aggression, or flight. It had no programming for dealing with a potential prey animal that was trying to establish communication. Kithara continued his careful communication, using the empathy and patience that Marcus had taught him to recognize that the shadow hunter was not evil or malicious, but simply a creature following its natural instincts. He offered no threat and no challenge, but he also showed no fear or submission. Instead, he projected calm confidence and genuine curiosity about the magnificent predator before him. Slowly, impossibly, the shadow hunter relaxed its attack posture. Its venom sacs retracted, its claws withdrew, and it began to respond to Kithara's communication attempts with tentative signals of its own. The two beings, predator and prey, began what could only be described as a conversation. The arena fell into absolute silence as everyone witnessed something that challenged the fundamental assumptions of their civilization. Strength was not just about surviving violence or inflicting damage. True strength could involve understanding, communication, and the courage to seek peaceful solutions, even in the face of mortal danger. Queen Vexithari rose from her seat, her voice carrying across the silent arena as she announced the end of the trial. "The test is complete," she declared. "My son has demonstrated a form of strength that our traditions never taught us to recognize. He has shown us that true power lies not in the ability to destroy, but in the wisdom to understand and the courage to choose compassion even when violence seems easier." General Thakran stepped forward, his voice filled with angry disbelief. "Your Majesty, this proves nothing except that your son has been corrupted by alien weakness. The shadow hunter will turn on him the moment his guard is down. This is not strength but foolish naivety that will get him killed." But even as the general spoke, the shadow hunter settled beside Kithara like a guardian rather than a threat, having found in the young Zephyrian something it had never encountered before, a being that offered partnership instead of domination. Queen Vexithari looked around her court, seeing the faces of nobles who were struggling to process what they had witnessed. The old ways had promised strength through suffering, but had delivered only trauma and decline. The human way,